guys, Pedro here with Syzygy Coffee, and today we are gonna try to answer the question that I get asked the most. How do I choose good coffee? Now, the best coffee and the best tasting coffee in the world is gonna depend on you. It is a personal preference. It doesn't matter how much it costs, the process that went into roasting and harvesting that coffee, the different roast profiles of that coffee bean. It all depends on your taste buds. Whatever you like the most, regardless of the price, is the best coffee. Now, when you start adding sustainability to the equation, then things get a little bit more complicated. If you take mass-produced coffee, which is generally found throughout the different grocery stores at a very cheap price, something's gotta give. Either the farmer's not getting paid well, or the coffee beans are not as fresh as they seem. Perhaps the roasting was done years ago, or simply the product is of lower quality. So as a general rule, good coffee is not going to be cheap. Now, don't let this scare you. It doesn't mean that good coffee needs to be expensive. The difference between cheap coffee and more expensive, sustainable specialty coffee is not as great as you think. Now, if you want to learn more about what goes behind a good cup of specialty coffee, just click this video right here. I explain the whole process from beginning to end, and hopefully you'll understand the importance of a sustainable cup. Now, let's get to it. How do I get good coffee? Now, with this video, I'm going to try to walk you guys through the same process that I go through whenever I choose to buy coffee. It may seem a little complicated at first, but trust me, it's very easy once you have the coffee bag in front of you. Now, unlike a book, you actually can judge a coffee bag by its cover, simply because there's a lot of information that is extremely useful and important for you to read and go through whenever you're picking coffee. Now, in no particular order, I'm going to show you guys the different things that the label within that coffee bag should have in order for you to make the right choice. Now, let's start off with the location. When I'm talking about location, I'm not referring to where that company is located or where the roasting was done. I'm talking about the green coffee itself, the origin of that green coffee bean. Now, when you're looking for that country of origin, a good and a safe bet would be, think of intertropical countries. Those are countries between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Kenya, Ethiopia, Indonesia. These countries have great weather, fantastic climate for the coffee plants, and you usually get great coffee from these countries. In the coffee business, we call this the coffee belt. Now that you have the location, you want to pinpoint exactly where that coffee comes from. And this is what we call traceability. So traceability gives you a more precise location of the origin. And we're talking about a city, a state, a farm, and even the name of the person who harvested that coffee. Generally speaking, the more precise you can pinpoint the location of that origin, the better the coffee you get. Another piece of information you want to look into is the altitude or the height at which that coffee was harvested. We're talking about anything anywhere from the low 2,000 feet above sea level all the way to 5,000 feet. Now, with coffee that's been harvested at a lower level, you'll get more familiar notes, perhaps a little bit more balanced coffee, and sometimes even bland. The higher you go, the more complex the flavor. You'll start getting some fruits, you'll start getting some acidity. Now, my recommendation would be, if you're just starting to get into the world of coffee and want to start trying things that are a little bit different, work your way up. Start from a low level, harvest 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet, all the way up. And you'll start noticing the difference between the different tasting notes. Now, the higher you go, the more complex the coffee cherry is. And when I'm talking about complexity, I'm talking about the flavor. And this is actually because the higher you go, that coffee cherry has less access to oxygen and water. So it develops the resources to reproduce. And all that energy that gets stored makes the bean, or the coffee cherry in this instance, be very, very delicious. All the energy goes and concentrates into that little fruit. And the higher you go, the more this becomes true. Now, for this reason, the higher you go, the less likely it is for that coffee to be mass produced. And also, the less likely it is to develop any sort of diseases. This is why whenever you're going to be comparing the same bean of that same brand, but one has been harvested higher than the other, the higher the altitude at which it was harvested, the more likely it is that that bag is going to be more expensive. Now, one of the most important things you should be looking for in a bag of coffee is the roast date. That roast date is going to tell you exactly when that green coffee was actually roasted. Now, don't get it confused by the best before date, because that could be 3 years down the line. And by that time, it's going to be very stale coffee. So the closer you buy that coffee to the roast date, the fresher it's going to be. Now, I should mention that if you are planning on buying coffee at a grocery store specifically, just keep in mind that their mindset is profits, and it's understandable. So what they do is they require roasters to put a best before date rather than a roasted on date. And the reason for this is this allows them to keep that coffee stored for months and years and just sell them down the line. At the end of the day, if that coffee is stored properly, it's not going to be harmful to your health once you drink it, even if it's years old. The only thing that will be affected is the taste. The fresher the coffee, the better it tastes. While we're on the topic of freshly roasted, we should talk about the harvest. Now, it's rare for the coffee bag to have the harvest, but if it does, that's a great and positive sign. The harvest tells you when that green coffee was processed or when it was harvested. Now, let me explain. Many companies, what they do is they have a surplus of green coffee and then they'll roast it down the line. So you could be drinking freshly roasted coffee, but that green coffee bean is actually months and years old. Now, this isn't actually a problem if the green coffee is properly stored, but it's definitely a good sign to see a harvest date on the bag. Another thing you should be looking for in a bag is the type of bean. While there are tons of beans out there, they usually come from two major sources. The two major beans in the planet are Arabica and Robusta. And if you want good and great tasting coffee, go with Arabica, always. A description you should be looking at is the roast profile. Now, the roast profile refers to how dark or light that coffee bean has been roasted. Generally speaking, the lighter the roast, the more associated it is to specialty coffee, simply because it keeps most of the flavors from that original green bean. The darker you go to an Italian roast or a French roast, you start losing those attributes, that acidity, that fruitiness, and you start going into a more burnt taste or bitter taste. In the coffee industry, when it is mass produced, they usually go to a very dark roast and you roast it really, really dark. You're gonna start hiding those attributes that are usually gonna be horrible to taste, and all you're going to be tasting in that cup is burnt coffee. Now, there's a reason why you can see a lot of dark roasted coffee out there, and the reason is quite interesting. If you take very high quality green coffee and very low quality cheap green coffee and you roast both of them to a very high temperature, essentially burning them to a very dark roast, and you brew them, they're essentially going to be the same. They're going to taste bitter and burnt. And what this does is hide the defects. So people are actually used to it. People are used to this type of coffee. That's why a lot of people tend to add sugar and cream and milk just to counteract that taste. So if you're a mass producer of coffee, what you're gonna do is buy very cheap green coffee and just take it to the darkest roast possible. Now, if you're unsure of if that coffee is very darkly roasted or not, a good rule of thumb is take a look at the bean. It will look dark, of course, but if it has like a little layer of oil around it, then just stay away and don't buy that coffee. What happened there is that the essential oils of that coffee bean head to the surface and get burnt in the roasting process. Try to focus on buying light, medium light, or even medium roasted coffees. One conversation I have with a ton of people is, should I buy whole bean coffee or ground coffee? And the answer is always going to be whole bean. And if you can, and my recommendation to everyone is buy a grinder, and buy a good grinder. The reason is, if you buy freshly ground coffee, it's great if you're gonna consume it in the next couple of days. However, since the particles are so small, it becomes very easy for the coffee to oxidize because it's easier for the oxygen to interact. What that does is it creates stale coffee. Now, if you can't afford a grinder, if you don't have space in your kitchen for a grinder, that's understandable. Try to buy small batches of ground coffee that you're going to consume the next couple of days. But remember, it's always better to buy whole bean coffee and grind it just a few minutes before you brew it. Another descriptor in the bag is going to be the notes. And this refers to the taste, what you're going to get in that cup of coffee once you brew it. Now, don't mistake this by something that's been infused with flavor. What I'm referring to is many coffees have been infused with vanilla or chocolate or bourbon. Now, when you're talking about notes in a specialty coffee bag in the scripture, they're just talking about the different lingering notes and the things you'll be tasting once you drink that cup of coffee. Nothing's been added to the bean or nothing's been added to the roasting process. It is simply what you'll be getting in that brewed coffee. So in terms of the notes, if you are somebody who likes citrusy flavors, something a little bit more fruity, something a little bit more bright, then you'll look at the notes, and if it says something along the lines of green apple, strawberry, lemon, lime, these are citrusy flavors. So you can expect that coffee, once brewed, to be very bright and very acidic. Now, if you're someone who likes something a little bit more traditional and you like to drink it with milk, for example, maybe you want something a little bit more balanced out. And the descriptor is going to be something like cinnamon or cocoa or chocolate. Now, lastly, the description you're going to be looking for in the bag is the process. Was it a naturally processed coffee or a washed or wet process? What this is referring to is how the green bean was processed, how the green bean was fermented. Now, generally speaking, throughout your life, most likely you've been drinking washed or wet processed coffee. That is pretty much what people are used to and are accustomed to. Now, naturally washed process have been gaining ground lately, and the reason for this is because it provides a very distinct cup. It is very interesting in terms of flavor. It is very complex, earthy, entertaining to drink naturally processed coffee. Now, with the process, there is no right or wrong. It is entirely up to you. I personally love naturally processed coffee as of late, but maybe I'll switch up in the next couple of weeks or months and go back to washed and so on and so forth. It is just a very vast amount of change between a washed coffee and a natural coffee because of the different tasting notes. And if you haven't tried natural coffee, give it a shot. It is fantastic. Now, that pretty much covers everything that you should expect in terms of the description in a coffee bag. But I am going to extend that a little bit further in terms of what you are physically going to be looking at. And in this case, I'm referring to the bag itself. So let me show you here real quick. This is one of our coffee bags. And in the back, you'll find the different descriptors, such as the origin, the process, the notes, and the roasted on date. And in the front, it's a quick description of our brand. But what's important is you'll see right there, it has a little valve. And what that little valve does is it prevents oxygen from getting in, but since this is freshly roasted coffee, it allows for gas to escape. That is specifically CO2. And what this does is it's a one-way valve that's going to prevent the coffee from going stale. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have vacuum-packed coffee. Some people call these the brick coffee or bricks of coffee simply because of the shape. It looks like a little brick. But overall, what these coffees tell you is that they're not fresh. If it were fresh coffee, this bag would not stay vacuumed because, as you know, freshly roasted coffee releases a lot of CO2. And if this coffee was fresh, the release of CO2 without a valve, because it doesn't have a valve, The release of CO2 would plump this bag up, fill it with CO2, and eventually explode, right? Or sometimes just stay very, very inflated. Whenever I talk to friends and tell them about vacuum packed coffee and how that coffee isn't actually fresh, they act surprised, and it's actually because of a great marketing strategy. There's many brands that use vacuum packed coffee as something positive because it just provides a premium feel. However, as you know, freshly roasted coffee releases a lot of CO2, and a vacuum packed coffee is not going to be fresh at all. And they actually market it as something positive, vacuum packed. And at the very back, you'll see it has a best before date of 2024. So yeah, I guess that gives you an idea of how fresh the coffee may be. So just to wrap it up, I do want to mention a few tips and tricks. And that would be, start off with buying the necessary amount of coffee. If you're someone who drinks a pound of coffee a week, then buy a pound of coffee a week. Try not to buy 5 pounds of coffee all at once. The reason for this is what we mentioned before. It's most likely gonna go stale, and by the time you reach that 5th pound of coffee, it's not gonna taste great. Now you may be asking, okay, where do I find coffee that fits this profile? So you have a few options. One is a supermarket. Now, generally speaking, you won't find a good coffee in a supermarket for what we discussed before. Remember, their priority is profits. But sometimes they hold specials on local groceries. And these local groceries work together with that supermarket, especially if it's not a large chain supermarket. These supermarkets will allow the sale of specialty coffee in their stores. Another option is a coffee shop. If you're frequently going to a coffee shop and you like their coffee, a good and safe bet is if you support them drinking their coffee, you'll have great luck buying their coffee beans. Now, a third option would be buying from an online store such as Syzygy. Now, the benefit with an online store such as ours is that we offer a subscription service. Now, you can buy a one-time coffee and just try it out. But if you're somebody who drinks a lot of coffee and you like our product and you want to buy a coffee bag once a week or 2 times a month, then we give you that option. You'll take away the headache of running out of coffee, and we'll be able to deliver that coffee to you on a monthly, weekly, or bi-weekly basis. Now, the benefit of an online store such as ours is that the descriptions that we talked about during the video are posted right there in our website. So all of the information regarding the location, the harvesting, the roast profile, you'll find everything inside the description of each of the coffees that we sell. Now, if you're interested in trying our coffee out, please go ahead and visit us at syzygycoffee.com or follow us in social media in TikTok, Twitter, or Instagram at syzygycoffee. If you're liking this content, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and go ahead, comment below. What would you like to see next? And just remember, life's too short to drink bad coffee. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.